The bright moon lit up the sky when suddenly several figures appeared running, shouting that they were going to destroy the demon. Without hesitation, a man leaped forward and charged toward them, leaving behind a trail of white light. As he approached the knight, an intense red mana flared behind his body. He launched a powerful magical attack at the warriors and crossed the battlefield, leaving trails of pink mana in his wake. An aura enveloped his body and the ground beneath the knight's feet began to tremble. The earth then split abruptly, releasing a destructive energy that caught the warriors by surprise. The man channeled a massive flow of energy toward them. With blood dripping from his mouth, he leaned on his sword and crouched down. His eyes suddenly opened and gusts of wind began to swirl around him. Gripping the sword tightly, he shifted his gaze and saw a girl standing in front of him, watching him. She looked furious. In her tone and gaze, there was indignation. She questioned the reasons that led him to do that, to seal a pact with the devil, and more than that, to betray them. Holding the blade before him, Nox remained silent for a moment. Then he lifted his face and a smile appeared on his lips. The accusation of betrayal seemed understandable in the eyes of others, but from his perspective, he hadn't betrayed anyone. The dust cloud around them made the scene even tenser as the girl listened intently. Nox calmly stated that the betrayal had come from them. Keeping the smile, he revealed that everything had started after the forced landing. Before his eyes, a bright blue lightning bolt appeared, along with the message that he had completed the first part of Leanhammers. In front of the computer, Chang Yu reflected on his performance. He concluded that it hadn't been too bad. Looking at the ashtray beside him, he commented to himself that this time he had gotten a lot of loot and completed several hidden quests. He analyzed the game's mission list, and when he looked at the calendar, he realized something even darker. He had only 1 month left to live. The narrative then went back 2 years in time. In an exam room, a doctor was evaluating an x-ray while Chang Yu sat silently. The doctor asked him not to panic, just to listen. Chang Yu's expression was one of absolute shock. With sunlight bathing the tall building, Chang Yu sat in a chair and stared at a document. He soon received a phone call where he was asked whether he had already been to 2 hospitals and whether he had visited the university hospital. They informed him that many tests had been done, but the results remained the same. Desperate, he heard that they could only prescribe painkillers for when the pain became unbearable. He lowered his hand, opened the bottle, but the pills fell to the floor. Sitting there, he murmured to himself that 2 years had already passed. Looking away, he saw countless trash bags. Suddenly, he covered his mouth with his hands. Seeing the blood on them, he was shocked and wondered if he was really close to death. He wiped his mouth with his hand and silently concluded that thinking about it wouldn't change anything. A notification appeared on his phone and he swiped the screen. Reading the hospital messages, he realized that despite everything, there was no one to talk to. Sayengi admitted that since losing his memory, no one had contacted him, and he had no one to reach out to either. With his eyes fixed on the bloody napkin, he murmured that he couldn't go anywhere in his condition. He placed the phone on the table and began to examine the various pamphlets. Then he crumpled them and threw them across the room. Sitting, his face sweating, he lowered his head. On the screen, a new message asked if he wanted to start a new game. Supposing that was all he had left, he confirmed. He created a name for his character and, visibly exhausted, wondered in his mind what kind of character he should create this time. He watched the loading screen where he saw 2 options: a genius with magical sensitivity or a genius in combat and swordsmanship. Surprised, he carefully read that choosing 2 or more genius traits would result in penalties. Thus, he should choose only 1 or none to avoid disadvantages. Among the negative traits, it said the character suffered from a terminal illness. Sitting, Nox slowly lifted his head. He had noticed that both he and his character were doomed. A new notification appeared, asking if he wanted to start the game with that character. With the mouse still in his hands, he hesitated. Suddenly, flows of blue mana appeared before him. He fell from the chair, and the images on the monitor blurred. On the floor, he trembled as he read the message. Character successfully created. In his mind, he thought he had already come to terms with the idea of death, but he still wanted to choose how to die. Suddenly, a message informed him that the character's name had been forcibly changed. A bright light filled the room. Clenching his hand, Nox woke up in a bed. He got up trying to catch his breath, sweat running down his face. Looking around, he realized where he was. He began to walk through the room, passed by the balcony, and stopped in front of the mirror. Surprised, he raised his hand toward the reflection and, in his thoughts, realized he had become the worst possible character. He was lost. In his mind, the scene of 3 swordsmen in combat appeared, and he recognized one of them as a member of the feared Third Dark family of the Leanhammers, allied with the world's largest criminal organization. While observing the room, he understood that the Harbor family had, for centuries, produced talented descendants, experts in magic and swordsmanship. However, his character was the only one without any gift. The image of him emerged clearly in his mind. Looking at a statue, he remembered that this character had developed resentment toward the world due to his lack of talent. In the end, he had signed a forbidden pact with the devil, and thus became the worst villain in the history of Leanhammers. Holding his own face, Nox wondered if it was just a dream. Standing in front of the mirror, he began to visualize several messages about his traits. Upon seeing this information, he smiled faintly and wondered if there was a status window. Astonished, he soon asked himself what was wrong with his abilities, especially since he had only 2 units of stamina. Carefully, he began analyzing his negative traits. Confused, he tried to understand whether this was really the character he had created. Holding the projection with his hands, he reflected on whether his character was also terminally ill, just like in real life, and if that meant reliving the same suffering once more. At that moment, Nox seriously recognized that, although he didn't know exactly why he had done it, when he looked back, he felt he understood. He imagined his real self and realized that deep down, he wanted to create a character similar to himself. He remembered when he created that being in front of the computer and thought about how much the sick character resembled him, lonely, on the verge of death, and with no one to trust. Looking at his own hand, the protagonist reflected that he hadn't really expected to become that character. Suddenly, a notification popped up, informing him of an unread message in his mailbox. Seeing the projections, he wondered about that unopened letter. Upon accessing it, he found a message where his real name was mentioned. Shocked, he questioned how the sender could know his name. An image of his family appeared in his mind, and he remembered that Nox was the name his parents had given him, though he no longer knew where they were. With his hand over his face, the protagonist began to wonder if the entity that had placed him there had access to a past he himself could no longer recall. Soon after, a new message appeared, stating that even if Nox didn't remember him, it was necessary to say that they hadn't seen each other for a long time. This revelation surprised him. Still stunned, Nox kept reading, until he found a line saying that he had done well over the past 2 years and therefore deserved to be in that place. Speechless, he stood still before the projection. Nox imagined many buildings around him and realized that this meant the world he was in wasn't real. Squinting, he mentally questioned what kind of place that was. Meanwhile, he clenched his fist upon reading a message from the unknown person, which said they couldn't reveal everything about themselves yet, but hoped to help him. Startled, Nox asked again whether that person truly wanted to help him. He then received guidance to enroll at Elodie Academy in order to develop his strength and stay as close as possible to the main storyline. He mentally visualized several faces as he read that the entire truth could be found in that place. Still dazed, he wondered how all of that would end. Holding his head, the protagonist told himself that he needed to calm down. Looking in the mirror, he stated that his current character had become the final boss of a game called N or Lunatic. With sadness, he admitted that being close to the story didn't mean much. In practice, it was as if they were just telling him to die. A greedy message suddenly appeared in his mind, and he understood that if Lienhavers was real, he couldn't refuse the mission of recovering his memories. With a serious expression, Nox imagined a magical book and concluded that he had to follow the main story at all costs. He believed that by doing so, he could regain his lost memories and find a way to contact that entity within the game. Clenching his fist tightly, the protagonist decided he would survive, even if he had to become the greatest villain to do so. He remembered how his character behaved at the end of the game and then smiled. Thinking about it, he realized little had changed in relation to his real life. 2 years ago, sitting in front of a doctor, Nox had lost his memory from the beginning and was a terminal patient. Every second was a countdown to his death, and he lived tormented by fear, waiting for that moment to arrive. The only difference now was the environment, a world he was already somewhat familiar with. Standing in the middle of the room, he looked at the current date. Closing his eyes, he reflected that even his death had changed. Looking away, he asked if this was his 28th attempt. When he opened the door to the room, he suddenly felt a pain in his hand. The protagonist froze, surprised by the sudden pain. Soon, a message appeared informing him that he had suffered a level 1 wrist sprain. Due to the effect of a minor affliction, he would need to rest extensively to recover. As he walked down the corridor, Nox wondered what kind of frail body that was. Suddenly, he collided with a maid, causing the dishes she was carrying to fall and shatter on the floor. She remained seated among the shards, frightened by what had happened. The servants, shocked, asked if that was really the young master. In pain, Nox held his injured hand and shouted that it hurt. He cast a serious look at the girl and mentally wondered if she was Lona. Stunned, Lona began apologizing desperately, saying she was very sorry for hurting him. Nox imagined Lona talking to another maid and realized that although she wasn't a main character, she used to talk behind his character's back. She looked at him with an innocent face and smiled. Nox, smiling back, said he would let her go this time, but made sure to emphasize with a satisfied look that if she made the same mistake again, there would be no forgiveness. Lona began to cry. Looking upward, the protagonist reflected on the silence hanging around them. The servants were dumbfounded, watching him with no idea what to do. Standing up, Nox thought to himself that he was considered the trash of the family. Curious, Lona asked where he was going so early in the morning. With a serious look, Nox replied that he was on his way to the training hall. The servants were surprised by what they heard. Smiling, the protagonist asked Lona to follow him. She was stunned by the request and wondered to herself if Nox was going to hit her with a wooden sword. They walked through the street until they spotted a huge building. Lona walked beside the protagonist when suddenly, she was surprised by what she saw on his back. The protagonist calmly realized that the first thing he needed to do was survive. After being on the brink of death, he felt even more confident. Nox remembered the moment he fell from the chair in real life. Tears rolled down his face. Looking around the courtyard, the protagonist emphasized that to survive, he needed to adapt quickly to the circumstances he found himself in. With his hand on his chin, Nox said aloud that this didn't mean there were no chances. Lona was surprised by his words. The protagonist presented a map and noted that, as a professional player who had completed a game 27 times, he knew all its hidden secrets. Looking upward, he asked for a status window to display the image of an angelic wing and a demonic one beside a golden shield. The image appeared in his mind. Nox emphasized that this game was both demonic and divine. It was a game whose central conflict was against the Empire and had numerous fandoms around the world. The protagonist stayed close to the constellations. Nox reflected on what made that game so special. It offered multiple development paths, with nearly infinite combinations of traits. The protagonist presented various tokens and highlighted that there were low-ranking traits as well as rare and common ones that could be chosen. Suddenly, one of the tokens began to glow with a golden light. Nox noticed that there were also genius traits, of which only one could be selected. Walking beside Lumina through the street, he explained that these genius traits facilitated skill development. Even so, he had made his choice. With a calm face, the protagonist presented the character's stats and explained that the game imposed progressive penalties. The more traits were selected, the greater the penalty limit would be. Because of this, he managed to choose 2 genius traits. Nox imagined a character spinning his blade, saying he was a genius of the sword and martial arts, capable of using swords and other bladed weapons. This trait had helped him reach the peak of basic martial arts. The character was enveloped in a flaming energy. The protagonist then reflected that the mana sensitivity genius increased sensitivity to magic and provided maximum efficiency in mana circulation. With his hand on his chin, Nox commented that there were many other useful traits. He imagined the character's gaze and thought that the mind's eye allowed him to see the status window of other characters. Thanks to this advantage, people began to applaud Nox. Meanwhile, he pondered that the master of acting, as the name suggested, boosted his theatrical abilities. Walking through the courtyard, the protagonist reasoned that the steel mentality allowed him to stay calm in battles or dangerous situations. The problem, however, were Nox's negative traits. Dazed, he realized he was in terminal condition. Analyzing all his negative traits, the protagonist smiled and commented that he was practically a walking hospital ward. His hands and feet were always cold and his legs were swollen because of it. Nox highlighted that with cold extremities, it was nearly impossible to enter frozen areas without a warming skill. In public, he began to faint. Holding his head, he assumed there wasn't much he could do about it. In front of a tall building, the protagonist decided he would resolve everything one step at a time. Lona watched him and wondered to herself if Nox really intended to enter the training hall. She was suddenly caught off guard. The protagonist looked at the building with a calm expression. Lona was right behind him. Nox opened the training hall's gate. He imagined a flaming skull and realized that the Curse of Exhaustion was an extremely powerful innate curse. This curse halved growth speed and made the player's body twice as vulnerable to enemy debuffs. Nox raised the wooden blade above his head. Holding the sword with both hands, the protagonist noted mentally that no matter how much he thought about it, the result was always the same. Nox was exhausted right after the first strike with the blade. He realized he was in trouble. Drops of sweat trickled down his face and his expression was pure fear. He threw the blade aside. The protagonist, completely worn out, couldn't stay on his feet and collapsed to the ground. He noticed that no one seemed to understand just how miserable that curse truly was. Sunlight filled the room. Lying on the floor, Nox emphasized that at the very least there were many weapons available. He presented the family's weapon code and remarked that, after all, the Reiner family history began with a sword. When it came to that family, despite positive declarations, they were best described by the title Great House of the Blade and Darkness. That title had been earned by combining swordsmanship and dark magic to destroy their enemies. The protagonist averted his gaze, turning inward. He imagined how dense and dark the mana emanating from a certain character was and realized it was due to the commander's sword. Also known as the tyrannical blade of darkness, it was wielded by a stranger who carried a massive black sword. Nox reasoned that this technique had been passed down from generation to generation, and that the tradition was still upheld. Holding his face in one hand, the protagonist thought that none of that applied to him. He reflected that there were other aristocratic advantages besides sword skills. For example, money. The room oozed glowed intensely. Smiling, Nox commented that money was the coolest thing of all. He imagined gold coins falling from the sky. He noted that the Linehammers were one of the most influential families in the Empire's history. They were indecently rich, so much so that even their useless descendants had enough money to never work a day in their lives. Nox remained seated on the floor. The protagonist imagined the face of a man and assumed it was likely Theodor, his character's father. Theodor seemed to care very little about how money was spent. An image of Theodor's face on the family crest appeared in Nox's mind. He began to rise from the floor. He held his trembling knees with both hands. Smiling, the protagonist noted that until Lona completed the task, he couldn't even escape. The story then rewound a few minutes. Nox was watching Lona. There was a teapot and a cup on the tray. Lona closed her eyes and informed him that his wooden sword, towel, and water were ready. She then opened her eyes and wondered whether the protagonist truly intended to train. Nox began waving his hand, calling her closer. Startled, Lona asked why he wanted her to come near. Frowning, she waited for a response. The protagonist asked what she was talking about. Nox grabbed her ear, leaned over her, and whispered something. Lona's scream echoed through the room. She spun around indignantly and asked if Nox intended to spend all the money on drinking every kind of disgusting thing. Closing his eyes, the protagonist ordered her to be quiet and go do her job. Lona quickly left the training room, her footsteps echoing in the space. Looking at the fallen blade on the floor, Nox thought he didn't know how fast she could manage that, but he'd be ready by tomorrow. He walked over to the tray, poured water into a cup, and drank some tea. As he drank, the protagonist reflected on the need to do something about the curse and his physical endurance. A man approached and greeted him, catching Nox off guard. He looked at the newcomer with a suspicious expression. The story then introduced the head butler Rodwell, one of the Reiner estate's administrators. He wasn't someone to be treated lightly. Holding some papers in his hands, Rodwell adjusted his vest flawlessly. Nox recognized him as his father's advisor and the true right-hand man of the family head, Theodore. He remembered seeing him kneeling before Theodore. The protagonist's hand began to tremble. He understood that this encounter was one of the hardest tests on his path. Nox looked at Rodwell seriously, then averted his gaze. The protagonist asked if Rodwell had noticed anything strange. Normally, that man didn't even pay him any attention. Placing the cup on its saucer, Nox decided that from now on, he would fix everything. Closing his eyes, he asked if Rodwell's duties included serving the head of the family directly. With a discreet bow, Rodwell replied that he had received orders and had come to deliver a message. He calmly informed him that the protagonist was expected to attend that evening's dinner. Smiling nervously, Nox began to tremble. He wondered if he was being dragged into a dinner without knowing almost anything about that family. He tried to say he couldn't go, but Rodwell interrupted him with a silent sigh. He said that a young lady from the Stiller family had arrived and would undergo night training. Nox visualized a girl wrapped in fiery mana standing before him. Rodwell made it clear that if he didn't attend, the master would certainly be furious. Averting his gaze, the protagonist sighed and agreed to go. Rodwell was surprised by the response. Observing Nox, he commented that something about him seemed different. The protagonist asked if he wanted to say anything else. Rodwell extended his hand and said he had never liked swords, but that Nox on his own had gone to the hall. He was curious about the reason. Staring at him, the protagonist replied that he needed to make something clear. Frowning, he ordered Rodwell never to dare place himself above his masters. He added that Rodwell was just a butler. Turning around, Nox began to walk away. He said that everything he thought or did was none of Rodwell's business, and that he would make his own decisions. Rodwell listened in silence and bowed slightly, apologizing. He remained still as the protagonist left the training hall. Looking at the gate, Rodwell asked himself whether Nox had noticed any change, as he needed to report it to the family head. The blue skies surrounded the Reiner estate. The protagonist closed his bedroom door. Stunned, Nox thought he would never have imagined such a thing could happen. Averting his gaze, he wondered what would happen if the possession activated. He then asked himself about the young lady from the Stiller family. With a serious expression, an image of a red-haired girl formed in his mind. Night fell. Seated at the table, one of the young men mockingly remarked that even an idiot had come, and asked how they were supposed to enjoy the meal now. Nox ignored them in silence. With ironic smiles on their faces, the others asked the protagonist not to say he was still attached to the family. The story introduced us to Hats and Alan. Extending his hand, Hats said he thought he'd never see Nox's face again. He also admitted he still didn't believe it. Smiling, he commented to Alan that Nox was staring at the servants, like the loser he had always been. Looking away, Nox thought he hadn't even done anything. Suddenly, a knock came at the door. The maids began to bow. The protagonist looked away. Theodore entered the room and assumed that everyone had already arrived. Nox looked at the girl beside him wearing a serious expression. Her dress sparkled brightly. Theodore, at her side, announced that the young lady from the Stiller family had requested night training and would therefore stay at the estate for a while. Hats and Alan observed her with curious smiles. Nox stood up from the table. The story introduced Thalia, the heroine of the Lienhabers, the character destined to face the villain. Thalia wore a faint smile on her face. A drop of sweat ran down the protagonist's cheek. He reasoned that in the near future, it would be that very girl who would pierce him with a sword. The starry sky enveloped the estate as Theodore, with a serious expression, remarked that even Nox had shown up. In response, the protagonist turned abruptly, surprising Thalia. The people at the table began to eat, and the twins exchanged glances with Nox smiling and pointing in his direction. Alan then suggested that it was the perfect time to announce who would be sent to the academy. While everyone remained attentive, the protagonist listened silently. Theodore, with one hand on his chin, agreed with the urgency of the decision. Nox, meanwhile, visualized a huge castle in his mind and recognized that Eldine Academy was the most important place in all of the lunatic hinterlands. A map appeared in his thoughts, and he reflected on the fact that the academy's students experienced extreme situations and fought demons, central elements of the story he knew. Amid his thoughts, he concluded that this was his destiny. He remembered the Academy's characters and recognized he needed to get close to them to follow the narrative and form alliances. During the meal, Theodore explained that only 3 members of each family could attend Eldenia Academy. With a more serious look, he justified the rule as a way to limit the noble's influence. Since he had already sent his 2 eldest sons, he had only 1 spot left. Smiling, he introduced his 3 children. The protagonist, analyzing the situation, understood that this was his only chance to gain allies within the academy. In front of the children, Theodore announced that he would respect the family's old tradition. Realizing this, Nox interpreted that there would be a competition among the younger children. The protagonist's quick reaction surprised Theodore, who didn't expect such an immediate response. The young man, however, firmly confirmed that the tradition would be upheld, and the result of the duel, which would take place in 1 month, would determine who would claim the final spot at Eldenia Academy. Alan, arms crossed, recommended that Nox remain discreet so as not to damage his image in front of others. Hats, more impetuous, provoked by stating that those without a sword in hand would never stand a chance against them. Thalia, curious, observed Nox attentively while sipping wine. The protagonist merely said they would only talk about it if he emerged victorious. Hats, indignant, asked if he truly believed he could defeat them. In silence, staring at his cup, the young man acknowledged that the duel was just another test to get into the academy, and that he had no time to care about mockery. He focused on the wine with a serious expression. Soon after, he affirmed to himself that regardless of everything, he would enter Elden Academy. Theodore simply watched him in silence. The twins didn't hide their fury at such a declaration, while Thalia, satisfied, interpreted it as confidence from the young master. Noticing her gaze, Nox was taken aback and, staring at the starry sky, thought that he had attracted the attention of someone it might be better to avoid. A light passed through the window, illuminating the desk where Theodore was analyzing some documents. He reflected on Rodwell's report and realized that, indeed, something had changed in Nox. He closed his eyes, trying to understand. Rodwell confirmed the suspicion and, touching his chin, maintained his observation. Theodore internally acknowledged that if he hadn't witnessed it personally, he wouldn't believe it. He questioned what could have caused such a change and pondered if a demon was involved, even considering a possible possession. Concerned, he asked Rodwell to watch him more closely. The next morning, Nox ran through the estate's courtyard. The matriarch watched him with a glance and murmured that in 1 month he would face a duel. Panting from the intensity of the exercise, he observed the maids and wondered how he could hear all the whispers around him. He kept running until receiving a notification that his stamina had increased by 1/10 of a unit. Trying to catch his breath, he reflected that his greatest obstacle at the moment was his low physical stamina. In his mind, he visualized a swordsman in motion and understood that to access combat skills, he needed to reach at least level 4 stamina. Closing his eyes, he regretted that his body was as weak as the original characters and concluded that if he were stronger, he could already use those abilities. He began examining his own stats. With a slight smile, he bowed his head and acknowledged that it had taken an entire month just to raise 2 stamina units. Faced with the image of a chained demon, he thought that the weakness curse was having his growth rate. Observing the projection, he concluded that even after so much effort, stamina had increased only by 1/10. He knew the disease also had all effects, meaning he would need to work 4 times harder than anyone else. Studying the projection closely, he realized that due to these imposed limitations, his stamina would never exceed level 15. Meanwhile, Lona pushed a cart down the street. With her eyes closed, she said she had brought everything he had requested. The protagonist, now more excited, believed he could finally make some progress. Touching the artifacts, he reflected on how to raise his stamina to level 4. As he held a vial, he remembered he would rely on his knowledge of the game. Sunlight filtered through the trees and lit the inside of the house. Lona, puzzled, asked why he needed all those items. Positioning herself behind him, she commented that the poison was rare and most people avoided it. Nox, serious, replied that no one knew how to use it correctly. Surprised, she questioned him about the method of use. In silence, he picked up a blue bottle and began drinking its contents. Alarmed, Lona screamed, warning that it was poison. Frowning, the protagonist acknowledged the danger but didn't hesitate. Soon after, he was surprised by a message informing him he had consumed the 3-headed Gorgon's poison, which would increase his health by 1.5 times, but that he had only 10 minutes left until death. His hands were sweating intensely. Desperate, Lona said she would call the butler. The protagonist, raising a hand, asked her to stop. Then he consumed a second artifact. Lona, in disbelief, screamed that the core was not meant to be ingested. Immediately, a notification appeared. Nox had consumed the golem's core and his body was beginning to slowly turn into stone. Another message stated that hidden data was being activated and that the Gorgon's poison was reacting with the core. With satisfaction, the protagonist realized that everything was working as expected. In his mind, he visualized a golem and remembered that the core was usually used to enhance physical defenses or create magical creatures. He thought of blue serpents and saw notifications indicating that the special effect had been activated. The Gorgon's poison had been completely neutralized and the curse of weakness was finally eliminated. With a relieved expression, he acknowledged that he had rid himself of the stupid curse that had been holding him back. Lona, visibly shaken, watched him in silence. With her hands on her head, she asked if he was okay. The protagonist, without saying a word, began to take off his shirt. Nox was buttoning up his shirt while the maid watched him, confused, unsure how to react to the situation. He was pouring the fairy's curse over himself, and a smile formed on his face as he commented that he felt something strange. His eyes were fixed on the cistern window, which indicated that the blessing had been absorbed until resistance level 5 was reached. His hand then reached for a package. With a persistent smile, Nox used the scroll of rapid resistance growth. Meanwhile, he thought he had overcome the curse and received a blessing that neutralized the disease. He clenched his fists tightly, full of determination. After some time, one of the maids tripped and fell onto him. With tears in her eyes, the young girl asked if he was okay. Lona screamed, accusing Nox of having improper intentions since he had started changing clothes so suddenly. There were tears on the girl's face. Nox looked at Lona with a serene smile, thinking that maybe he should go easier on her. Calmly, he replied that he was fine. The girl screamed again, asking if he really did need help. He looked in her direction and firmly stated that he was sure of it. Nox then smiled and said he was going to run down the street. The hero, still tired, looked ahead before running along the road. Lona followed him. Behind the bars, someone watched them silently. Thalia, intrigued, reflected on Nox's behavior. Perplexed, she asked why someone so weak would go against his brothers. Emma sighed and warned her not to judge the young master like that. The maid, indignant, shouted that what she said was very rude. Thalia turned her gaze back to Nox in astonishment, saying he just ran without even picking up a sword. Even when the knights offered help, the boy refused. The heroine commented coldly that at that pace, they'd turn him into a pork chop. The girl was convinced everything would end badly. A note opened slightly. Emma watched the girl with confusion. The heroine entered the estate confidently, saying she would be back soon. Inside the building, a shadow approached Nox. Tired, he raised his head to see the figure drawing near. With a smile, the girl introduced herself as Thalia. Nox stared at her, surprised, not understanding why she had come to him. He stood up and asked what she wanted, since he had heard her name several times. Thalia, confused, thought about the cold tone coming from the boy. She was shocked by his beauty. Confidently, the heroine asked why he was so sure he would win the battle. Nox remained silent. Lona watched everything calmly from the background. Thalia smiled and suggested he ask for help. The hero, with composure, asked if she could leave since he had refused her offer. Angrily, Thalia said that was how he responded to other people's good intentions. Lona continued watching with a light smile. Thalia shouted for Nox to forget all of it. Then she laughed and told him to do whatever he wanted. Lona nodded and commented that Nox didn't understand anything. He watched her leave, hoping everything would be alright. The system displayed a new window with the girl's stats and strength. The hero was surprised at how powerful she was, even more than many men. He concluded that Thalia couldn't even be compared to the 3 swordmasters of the continent. Nox realized she certainly did well in battles against demons. Her primary element was fire. The elemental magic she wielded had awakened as white flame, capable of burning everything around it. The hero knew that if he could win her over, the plot would change drastically. A month later at the estate, Thalia walked through the corridors. With a displeased expression, she didn't know what to say or do. The boys greeted her with smiles, saying they were learning very quickly. One of the knights confidently stated that it was expected, coming from a talent of the Stiller family. Thalia looked ahead thoughtful. Her eyes shifted to the side. Sitting on the floor with a broken sword on her lap, Thalia watched her sister. She continued walking, gripping the sword in her hands. With a sad look, Thalia wondered if she would ever be a true knight. She reflected that a knight must be modest, avoid greed, and risk their life for a good cause. She concluded that after that, she would need to master the sword to be worthy of the title. With a distant gaze, she doubted that was possible. The next day, behind the estate's gates, a crowd gathered on the street. 2 boys stood face to face. People watched them attentively. On the balcony, Felicia watched closely. Rodwell analyzed the boy before him and asked Theodore how that duel would end. The butler looked at the ground, thoughtful. One of the boys shouted loudly, asking for everyone's attention. He declared that the duel would decide who would enter the Eldenia Academy. Nox clenched his teeth, determined. The duel began. Theodore confidently awaited a response from the butler. Rodwell calmly replied that, considering the young master's previous duels, it was obvious the opponent would win. The father agreed calmly, saying he was probably right. The wife turned her gaze away, watching intently. The father then looked at his son, realizing that he had changed. However, despite that, he concluded that he still wouldn't win. The hero looked ahead, and everyone understood it was impossible. Once upon a time, that young man had also walked the path of the sword. The art of fencing could be winding, but at the same time, extremely simple. The time spent training and the way one assesses their own skills determine the true level of a swordsman. Theodore watched the fight attentively, understanding that there was only one chance for someone far ahead to end up on their knees before the next week. The son looked up at the balcony. Rodwell wondered, intrigued, if the hero had been born with that talent. The man then looked at the master with confidence. Theodore, apprehensive, responded that there was still a chance. Even as the youngest son, the family's blood still ran through his veins, and that meant he might become the future emperor. The genius of fencing and combat remained dormant. Nox, confused, couldn't understand why he was so far from success. The system window displayed which effect traits were active. The resistance indicator was among the highest. Lona approached the boy. Visibly tired, the girl asked the hero if it was really necessary for her to keep running after him. Nox laughed and asked who else would do it if not her. With a smile, he told the heroine that this was a mission meant for her. Lona frowned at Nox and made a face, saying she had bitten her tongue. The boy laughed. After some time, Nox began to realize that the girl had impressive stamina, which needed to be put to the test. The system window showed that her resistance was higher than his. The hero couldn't understand what was happening with that family. With sadness, Nox commented that Lona's initial stat was higher than his, even after all his efforts to improve it. Calmly, the girl replied that there would be a duel the next day, so she needed to rest. Nox understood silently that there was no more time left. His brother called out to him. Hat smiled and asked why he hadn't given up yet. The hero replied serenely that, although he was ashamed to the family, he was also the youngest brother, and for that reason, he couldn't be cruel to him. Calmly, Nox explained that he wanted to impress Thalia and therefore needed help. The boy was torn about what to do. He knew his brother's resistance was 8, which meant he wouldn't win with ordinary methods. Shouting, he announced that the duel was about to begin. Firmly, he declared that both would accept the outcome, no matter what happened. Nox felt the weight of responsibility. He knew that if he lost, everything would be over. But he also needed to recover his memories and find out who had sent him that mysterious message. He picked up his sword, aware that he had only 1 year of life left. He looked around and asked if everyone was ready. The duel began. His brother immediately knocked him to the ground. Hatz's leg rose for a strike. The hero turned his gaze away with confidence. Nox quickly got up, holding his sword firmly. His hand gripped the hilt with determination. Hatz laughed, commenting that his defense was good. The two continued to fight. Nox knew that if he lost, he would lose absolutely everything. The system window indicated an increase in his resistance. The hero looked upward. His brother began laughing, saying that if he won, he would take everything. Confused, Hatz asked if he had hit his head too hard. The fight between the brothers intensified with each blow. Felicia smiled, calmly commenting that she had worried for nothing. She said maybe the youngest had changed. After all, he was the last son of that family, and he would be her son. The battle continued. The heroine observed the knight silently. Theodor followed every move. The wife kept laughing. The father couldn't believe what he was seeing. Nox was showing all of his potential. Everyone understood that if it continued, the hero would need a long time to recover. Hatz laughed, asking if Nox was already tired. The ability to dominate everything around him and defeat his opponent through pure power began to manifest. The dominant shadow blade gleamed. Nox sighed, exhausted. Theodor didn't understand what was about to happen. He wanted to get up to stop the fight. Suddenly, a new system window appeared, showing that Nox had increased his resistance. The hero began to smile. Hatz laughed, asking if he had finally gone mad. The father watched everything without understanding. Nox held the sword firmly. Everyone watched the duel, surprised. His brother laughed, and Nox calmly replied that talents and geniuses have their own timing. He gave a wide smile. At that moment, the hero realized time seemed to have stopped. Everything around him slowed down in his perception. Calmly, he said that slow movements and enemy acceleration are completely different things. Hatz raised his sword, but Nox already knew everything was decided. The hero's hand gripped his weapon tightly. He attacked swiftly. Hatz, surprised, couldn't understand how his brother was doing it. Nox smiled gently and firmly declared that he would win that duel. The sword fell to the ground. Hatz grabbed his own wrist in frustration. Even so, his hands still held the sword tightly. Nox smiled, saying he was having a lot of fun. Hatz sat there, not understanding anything. His brother knew he shouldn't lower his guard. Nox, in turn, understood that this ability only lasted 5 minutes. He needed to finish the fight before time ran out. Calmly, he declared he was trying to go easy on his brother. Hatz flailed his arms, complaining that it was really boring. Nox then suggested that the two brothers attack him together, so it would all end faster. Hatz and Alan looked at each other, unsure of what to do. Nox looked directly at his father, asking for permission to face them both at the same time. Theodor didn't know how to react. The butler gave the master a subtle glance. Thalia, frightened, couldn't understand what Nox was trying to do. The knight, with a faint smile, realized Nox's energy had changed. That meant it was worth watching a bit longer. Theodor shouted loudly that he authorized the duel. Felicia rose from her chair, displeased. The knight then shouted, announcing that the boys could begin. Hatz picked up his sword, visibly irritated. Alan, enraged, wondered how Nox dared to underestimate them like that. The hero smiled sweetly. The brothers shouted for him to prepare himself. Then they ran toward him. A true duel began. Nox was fighting both brothers at once. Hatz, annoyed, shouted for Alan to come from the other side. Nox shouted too, facing both of them. With focus, he began analyzing every movement of his brothers. The system window revealed that the special effect had increased. Nox smiled. He could now predict their movements. The brothers attacked with force. Suddenly, one of them cried out in pain. His shoulder had been struck. The three were positioned in different directions. Thalia screamed Nox's name in fear. The hero looked at everyone with a calm, victorious smile. The brothers couldn't understand how Nox had changed and grown so much in such a short time. The young man still didn't understand why Thalia had come looking for him. Nox tried to speak, but the girl interrupted him with an unexpected question. She wanted to know how he managed to fight his own brothers and win, even with such a weakened body. He clenched his teeth in silence while Thalia, embarrassed, covered her face with her hands. The heroine explained that she had misunderstood everything. During the observation month, she noticed that he had never used a real sword and that on the first day he had only swung a wooden sword, relying on a stance that seemed absurd. With that memory in mind, Thalia had run to him, convinced that she needed to find out how that power had awakened inside him. Nox, filled with fear, watched her, trying to understand her intentions. The young woman, still bewildered, wondered silently why he had acted that way, since he didn't even seem to try during the duel in the arena. As she wiped her face, she looked away and commented that many rumors had circulated about how hard he had worked to earn that opportunity. When he coughed discreetly into his hand, she, alarmed, started asking if he was all right. Nox pushed her hand away firmly, showing some displeasure and asking her not to touch him. He reflected that after spending 2 years isolated in a room playing games, his ability to communicate with people had weakened. The heroine touched his hands gently, apologizing, visibly concerned. Confused by the gesture, Nox asked what she was doing. Thalia replied calmly that she didn't know he was serious about the sword. According to her, everyone always said he had been born weak. Then she remembered the race in which she had seen him and, embarrassed, apologized for the misunderstanding. She said anyone could make mistakes. Nox didn't know how to react, but he understood that this girl was as serious as she was in the game. Moreover, she was a duchess known for her stubbornness and sense of honor, and admitting mistakes probably wasn't easy for someone with that kind of stance. Stucky remained silent and stated it would be better if she didn't reveal what she had seen. Thalia firmly promised she would keep the secret. Observing her, Nox realized that from that moment on, there was no longer any reason to be afraid. Thalia, in turn, looked at him with a confused expression. Back at the estate, the knight settled into a chair, stating that his suspicions had been confirmed. Theodore, curious, asked Rodwell how he would explain that kind of talent. The butler, surprised, replied that he still didn't understand why the young man had accepted the blows at the beginning. The older man said that in his experience, it was already clear that the boy was the best among the young masters. The knight calmly agreed, saying he felt the same way. Recalling Nox, he concluded that something more was hidden inside him. Theodore then instructed the butler to carefully observe every one of the boy's actions, but only to observe. The knight silently pondered whether the youngest among them would be worthy of inheriting the black sword. Looking away, he became aware that time was running out. With firmness, he told the other man that his role was of utmost importance. Rodwell bowed respectfully, promising to do his best. That night, the estate was glowing. A cistern window notified Nox that his mission had been completed. The young man carefully analyzed the notification, which indicated the reward was being calculated. He would receive it soon. Looking away, he thought to himself how incredible that was. Immediately, he began managing his stats. He tried to improve his endurance, noticing that his luck stat was at 10. Smiling, he considered that this value would be quite useful. Next, he decided to test how effective the luck stat was. The system window informed him that he would receive privileges for multiple rolls, and the dice began rolling one by one. Nox watched closely, realizing that the bonus system was working very well. He decided to continue. Suddenly, a huge magic orb formed next to him. He found it very strange to witness such a thing in real life. When his hand touched the lock, he understood that with high luck, the probability of success had to be close to 95% for medium or high levels. In front of him, a gigantic machine stood still. 3 scrolls floated in the air. Gray for low level, silver for medium, gold for high, and rainbow for the highest. Nox intensely hoped for a gold or rainbow scroll. A sphere was expelled from the machine, lighting up the room brightly. Upon closer inspection, he saw he was holding a golden scroll in his hands. He opened it quickly. The system window began congratulating him for obtaining a superior grade trait. He began to laugh loudly in disbelief at what he was seeing. The windows displayed all information about him. He shouted in shock, saying he couldn't believe he was holding a divine level item. Still, he understood that this wasn't the full reward. Soon, the window asked if he wanted to use a unique ticket for a specific ability. Reading the description, he realized the ability was already predetermined. To obtain it, a specific requirement had to be met. Nox concluded that Theodore would soon summon his older brothers, which meant the moment to use that ability was approaching. He also realized his brother's return was imminent, as a lot of time had passed since his graduation from the academy. Holding his head, he regretted not having a single moment of peace. He hoped he wouldn't have to get involved with Thalia again. He recognized that she was someone who didn't break promises, and besides, there was no longer any reason for her to seek him out. During the night in the estate's corridors, Nox sighed, filled with unease. Thalia was by his side. He replied calmly that their conversation wasn't over yet. The young woman made a request, but Nox didn't quite understand what exactly was being asked. Then Thalia, visibly confused, asked what she had to do to become as strong as he was. Nox didn't know what to say. The hero stepped away and told the girl that she had been nearby the whole time he trained and had seen everything he did. Thalia, however, didn't understand what he meant. The heroine began to insist, asking for a fight so he could show her how to train properly. Nox lowered his gaze, realizing that Thalia was a character who desperately craved her sister's recognition. The hero looked back at her and asked that she not hassle him. Then he stared at her firmly and asked her to reflect on her own abilities. Thalia was deeply surprised by his words, The hero then raised his eyes, confused, thinking he had never been someone who comforted others. Soon after, he began advising the girl, asking her not to compare herself to others. He started walking away, leaving Fele behind. Her mouth parted in astonishment. The heroine couldn't understand why he had walked away so calmly. As he walked off, Nox glanced sideways, wondering if she would follow or not. The young man headed toward the master, knowing it was no use showing her every step of his journey. Theodor was observing his son carefully. That place was one of the top 3 purebred horse breeding stables, the Raider family stables. Rodwell bowed before the master. The father calmly stated that everyone there knew very well why they were gathered. Theodor confidently responded that that day each of them was to choose the horse they would spend the rest of their lives with. Nox smiled, stating he knew that and that his time had come. On that continent, the horse was considered a sacred animal. Any person wishing to become a knight or a mage had to choose a horse in their childhood to be their lifelong companion. At the academy, equestrianism held a prominent position, and in the second part of the game, there were many battles. Therefore, if the horse did not survive, it would be necessary to raise a new one from scratch. Additionally, teleportation magic was extremely expensive. Nox understood that a horse was an essential means of transportation. For this reason, he knew he needed to choose the best one. Theodor looked ahead upon hearing his father allow him to choose the first horse. The victory in the duel had granted him this right. The brothers looked at him with displeasure. The hero returned their gaze with a calm smile. Then he carefully entered the corral. The master began observing every movement. Theodor also paid attention, curious to see which horse the youngest son would choose. The stable housed a large number of horses. Nox fixed his gaze on one, finding it very cute. The hero looked away and suddenly spotted the horse he was searching for. Among so many identical animals, one stood out due to its distinctive coloring. Nox approached slowly. With a smile on his face, he confirmed that this was his choice. The brothers watched him, not understanding. The knight also did not know how to react. Theodor raised his hand and said he would allow a second choice. For a moment, Nox considered the possibility. The horse, however, remained calm. The hero carefully analyzed the animal. Suddenly, a system window appeared over the stallion. The data indicated that the horse had a high ranking. Common living beings were divided by classifications, which could evolve over time until reaching the superior grade. Nox smiled, realizing that in the future, this would be a high-ranking horse. Moreover, its obsidian-colored coat linked it to black gemstones, with this breed being considered the most expensive. The young man understood that had his father had access to that system window, he would have chosen that foal long ago. Even with its fragile appearance, the system clearly showed that the horse was promising. Nox smiled sweetly. With calmness, he stated that he would not change his choice. He had decided to take that particular horse. The young man knew that, with his knowledge, he would be able to save it. His father, on the other hand, could not understand the reason for this decision. Theodor deduced that Nox had been guided by compassion. Deep down, he hoped his son wouldn't regret it. The knight began to leave. The brothers called out to him. Nox cast a discreet glance at his father, not understanding his behavior. Rodwell then asked the young man to name his new horse. The animal gently bit the boy's hand. Nox observed it for a moment. He approached and said that its name would be Carl. That name had been created specifically for one of the game's passages. The young man knew that it held symbolic value for him. The property was opened and the horse entered in silence. Nox understood that no one should see what he was about to do next. So he decided that Carl would stay in his room. The young man looked at the floor, while the horse silently observed him. As he met the animal's eyes, he realized they reflected an unwavering willpower. The hero felt there was something in common between them. Looking away, Nox told the maid that he knew she was hiding a girl. Sitting on the floor, scratching her head, the young woman appeared. The hero calmly remarked that she had arrived at a good time. He pointed to the horse and asked her to take care of it. The maid replied that he himself would clean it. Nox laughed, saying that he was sick and therefore needed care. Carl watched everything serenely. The girl then responded that she had understood. The hero laughed again, wondering mentally if this fragile girl would be able to handle it. Carl was lying at the heroine's feet. 3 days later, the sun was shining over the building. Someone screamed, breaking the morning silence. Lona held the animal in her arms, desperate, saying that Carl wasn't breathing. Nox observed the scene and thought she was crying for nothing. The memory of the horse and the girl invaded his thoughts, and he kept reflecting. He acknowledged with some honesty that Lona had always taken good care of the animal. He suspected that from the beginning, she had known this might happen. Looking at the horse, he thought there was nothing else to be done. He approached Lona and told her she needed to stop crying as it was breaking his concentration. The girl then called the master, claiming that Carl had assured her she didn't need to worry, as he would be by their side again soon. Lona also asked if the young master had been injured in the accident. He merely nodded, indicating that he had. Nox asked her to step back and then pulled a scroll from inside his cloak. The girl watched, surprised, and asked what that scroll was. The hero placed a sheet on the table, and immediately purple flames began to burn around it. He silently wondered whether channeling mana into that scroll would have any effect. Lona was left speechless upon seeing the energy forming. The protagonist smiled at her surprise. She wanted to know what he had done, and Nox explained that he had used mana. However, he realized there was a problem. His control was unstable. He furrowed his brow, worried, thinking that if he shouted or made a mistake, he could end up killing Carl again, and that would weigh on the girl's conscience. She covered her mouth, frightened. Nox knew he needed to focus. He knelt down, determined, reflecting that without mastering mana, he wouldn't even be able to activate his special skill. He remembered that in the Empire, the use of magic was forbidden for those under 15, except for members of the imperial family. Thanks to this law, the children of magical nobility developed their abilities much earlier than others. While the purple fire burned, he realized he was emitting mana uncontrollably. He placed his hands on the ground and felt a subtle energy running through his fingers. He opened his mouth, surprised by the discovery. That was mana. He smiled, finding it amusing to use a unique skill ticket. He spread his fingers wide and understood he couldn't afford to make mistakes. The system then revealed that he had received the assassin's skill book, the Necronomicon. He assumed it was black magic. Soon after, a skeletal hand emerged to grab the book. The interface indicated that the selected target was Carl, and the option to resurrect him appeared. Sparks began to form around the horse. The interface asked if he wanted to use magic. The animal remained lying on the ground. Now surrounded by flames, the hero knew what the ritual meant. He recalled that the so-called rebels and lunatics who had been resurrected possessed two notable traits. First, they returned to life through dark mana and black magic. Second, they did not lose their individuality, becoming even more powerful. Moreover, they showed absolute loyalty to their masters. However, there was a caveat. Only one family had the legitimate power to create such creatures, the Marbas, a lineage of dark mages. He compared them to the Lienhabers, who, although also nobles, were knights, not practitioners of necromantic arts. He knew that players outside the Marbas lineage should not be able to use this kind of magic. Even so, the book dropped to the floor. Nox smiled, recognizing the unique skill he had received, the Necronomicon. Also an assassin's grimoire. From the ground, hands began to emerge. Black clots spread around the hero, reaching the horse. Nox felt fear. Lona called him again, frightened, but he only furrowed his brow, asking her to remain silent for just a moment longer. Right after that, a sound interrupted his thoughts. When he looked up, he saw blood splatter before him. His hand trembled. He realized his energy had run out. But to his surprise, the horse leaped up. The animal opened its mouth, a sign that the skill had been successfully activated. Nox watched in shock. Carl had been resurrected. His eyes now shone intensely. The hero felt a mix of relief and euphoria. Lona, still frightened, called him, afraid of what had just happened. Nox looked at her in surprise, still processing what he was seeing. When he said the horse's name, Carl approached him, lowering his snout. Positive characteristics detected with classification. High in growth, increased by 1.5x. As a dead living animal, Carl could now be summoned with his master's mana. Nox understood that it had worked. He petted the horse, acknowledging him as his partner. For a moment, his eyes widened. Carl stared at him intently. Lona ran to hug them both him and the horse. Nox called her, confused, asking what she was doing. She was crying intensely, explaining that she thought something terrible had happened. She said it was scary to see someone control mana so easily. She still believed Carl was sick. The horse closed his eyes, calm. The girl called to him, disconcerted, saying that at least he knew how loved he was. In a playful tone, she demanded all the carrots she had brought. The horse neighed, and the protagonist smiled. He thought it was a good moment for an Easter egg. A few days later, a man climbed the stairs. Carl remained motionless in the pen. The protagonist walked straight ahead under the dark sky, illuminated by the moon. In one hand, he held a stone. In the other, a piece of paper. Looking at the objects, he thought the road was incredibly similar to the one in the game. At least that was comforting. He looked ahead, determined to acquire the second relic of the Lienhabers family. He knew he needed to obtain it at any cost. The relic was the key to alleviating the effects of his incurable disease. Suddenly, a sound from the bushes alerted him. He quickly turned, watching the vegetation carefully. He thought maybe he was overreacting to the fear, but then he noticed a wooden plaque lying on the ground. He read what was written and felt a chill run down his spine. The reality of the world hit him hard. It was no longer a game. It was his new life. The plaque said, "Forest of the Missing Children. Small children are prohibited. Any child who enters this forest will surely get lost and will die." The protagonist thought firmly and fearfully. He didn't want to die a second time. Nox entered the Forest of the Lost Children, a place where failure to complete the journey would result in death. The forest was the only one within the Lienhabers' domain where entry was strictly prohibited. Due to the darkness and the constant fog, even experienced professionals found it extremely difficult to navigate there. The young man thought that, as the name suggested, anyone who entered would get lost like small children. Despite this, he frowned as he remembered a much more serious problem. Even if an adult defeated a monster, they wouldn't be able to extract an artifact from it. He shuddered to think that the older and more experienced the person was, the stronger the monsters became. He recalled how many times he had died trying to clear that zone and concluded that the difficulty of the forest was, at the very least, 2.5 stars. He thought about how unforgiving the game was with its difficulty. He reflected on the time he had wasted there before without even imagining what he would gain in return. Thinking carefully, he realized that this was the perfect item for someone in a terminal state like him. He stepped onto the ground and decided to explore the area. He lit a torch, its bright light illuminating part of the path. He advanced through the forest, reflecting on the main trick to survive in this place. He concluded that he should head in the opposite direction of the smoke, not toward it. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to focus. Before advancing further, he paused and wondered how much longer the hidden presence planned to remain concealed. He turned with his senses sharpened, wondering if the game had reached its decisive moment. As he brandished his sword, he felt the air being cut by something invisible. A voice was heard, seeming incredulous at the boy's indifference to its appearance. Meanwhile, the sun illuminated a distant room. Thalia stated firmly that the situation could not be real. Emma, worried, begged the young woman to stop chasing after Master Nox, fearing that it would lead to serious consequences. However, the warning was ignored, and Thalia assured that she would be careful not to be dismissed. The other girl replied, indicating that her concern was something else. On a table, Sveta observed in silence. Thoughts stirred in Thalia's mind, and she believed she already had enough talent to be recognized as the next matriarch. If it weren't for Emma, who seemed so envious of her own sister, Thalia might have already earned that recognition. Emma, in her restlessness, mentally questioned the impatience of the young woman always chasing after Nox. As she approached the door of the room, she assumed the young woman was already asleep. When she entered and called for her hesitantly, her fingers trembled, dreading what she might find. She thought she didn't want anyone to say something inappropriate. Leaving to search for Nox, she noticed the light turning on in the windows. In the forest, Thalia raised her hands with a smile when she was caught by Nox. He looked at her in perplexity, trying to understand her presence there. Running toward her, he urgently ordered her to go back. Thalia seemed confused by his reaction. A sound on the ground alerted them. The paws of an animal were approaching, and its tail was wagging. As they bared their teeth, the wolves revealed their threatening presence. Nox immediately recognized them as gray wolves and noticed that the only weapon he had was a dagger. He protected Thalia by holding her around the waist. The wolf, enraged, raised its head to the sky and let out a howl. The moon illuminated the sky, creating a dark scene. The animal opened its mouth to attack. Nox smiled and charged at it. With a precise strike, he sent the wolf flying. Thalia watched the scene in astonishment, thinking how impressive it was that, even though it was just a wolf, the kill had been so clean. Nox, with blood on his face, turned to her. He had once again wondered what she was doing in that place. Thalia, still stammering, tried to justify her presence as just a simple night stroll. He looked at her firmly, making it clear that he didn't accept lies and that if she insisted, he would leave her alone in the forest. Frightened, she grabbed his hand. He looked into her eyes, searching for an honest answer. She stated that she hadn't done anything strange, but admitted that she found him incredibly strong. She admired the idea of becoming as skilled as him. However, when she saw him through the window, she became curious and decided to follow him, ending up in that forest. Hearing this, Nox became certain of 3 things. He knew that she admired him, that she harbored some hostility toward him, and above all, that she was still a child unaware of the danger of following someone late at night. Thalia looked at him with a mix of pity and shame. Nox understood that since she was an important character, leaving her alone there wasn't a viable option. He ordered her to follow him. As they walked, he clarified that he wasn't doing it for her, but to protect his family's name. Thalia lowered her head and apologized. Nox concluded that she probably wouldn't put herself at risk like that again. The girl thanked him and called him by name. He looked at her in surprise, and she, realizing what she had said, became embarrassed. Wolves appeared around them, and Thalia called him again. He responded firmly, lighting the torch once more. With the light, he prepared to face them while protecting the girl. Thalia trembled from head to toe. The man ordered her to retreat, and when she opened her mouth to respond, he interrupted her, saying that if they needed to fight, she would only get in the way. He reflected that despite the unexpected circumstances, he needed to maintain his focus. Nox observed the wolves and thought that these creatures hadn't lived long enough to even witness the beginning of the story. For him, they were just in the prologue. As he analyzed the animals, he found it unlikely that there was a boss monster in the area, but he was almost certain that a lower-level creature would appear, probably an evolved gray wolf. Indeed, before his eyes, an elite gray wolf revealed itself. Even upon recognizing the enemy, Nox knew this didn't make the situation any easier. With a strike, he sliced through the space with his weapon. While noticing that, at times, the wolf would open its mouth in a threatening manner. He continued reflecting that often the only chance of salvation arises when someone is cornered. When he lifted his eyes, he saw wolves advancing from all directions. He furrowed his brow, convinced that he needed to repeat to himself what he usually told himself, just as Michael did. He'd raise his hand just as he did in the games he played during his moments of fury. He brandished his weapon, struck with all his might, and frustrated, thought he was weak. He took a deep breath, his hand gripping a torch. Thalia, in shock, watched and was surprised. She was sure he wasn't even using all of his strength. She remembered that in duels against her brothers, Nox's technique was even more intense. Looking at the animal, she recognized that he had already faced gray wolves before. Watching the torch, she recalled his words telling her to stay away. There was sadness in her thoughts, realizing that Nox still considered her weak. Her eyes widened and she stayed behind him, motionless. The torchlight illuminated the surroundings, and Nox understood that something was finally emerging. A paw touched the ground with enormous claws scratching the earth. Looking directly at the animal, he recognized the elite gray wolf. The light highlighted green leaves around them, while people shouted and asked for more torches. The signs clearly indicated the danger. This was the Forest of the Lost Children, a place where small children should never enter, as they would surely get lost and die. A man examined tracks and observed that the prints of two small sets of paws resembled those of the young masters. With concern, he concluded that the young master had apparently entered that forbidden forest. The maid reacted with shock and fear. The man continued, asserting that Thalia was involved. The girl, desperate, exclaimed that it couldn't be true, and asked what they should do, saying it was urgent. He interrupted her abruptly, ordering her to stop with the nonsense and reaffirming that it was impossible. Emma, still confused, wanted to understand why this hypothesis seemed so absurd, especially considering that even the Ranners hadn't been able to deal with that forest. The Forest of the Lost Children was one of the most dangerous places in all of Ranner's territory, and the fact that the most powerful family in the south couldn't clear it only reinforced its difficulty. However, few knew that the forest didn't allow adults or experienced people to enter. Only children had the ability to purify it. Robelo reflected on why the young master had gone there. He suspected that he might have been drawn by a monster with mind control abilities. Analyzing the tracks, he saw that the young man had walked with extreme care. Moreover, there were no signs of intruders on the property, which led him to conclude that the entry into the forest had been intentional. Clenching his fist, he admitted to himself that he had been wrong about the boy. When he lifted his head, he realized it was time to acknowledge. Nox was no longer the fragile boy he once was. From then on, there were only two possibilities left. An inner voice suggested that the young master should think carefully and find a way out. As he walked through the forest with a torch, the maid watched him, filled with fear. The people around also held torches and stared into the dark. Tears streamed down the girl's face, blaming herself, thinking that Thalia would die because of her. The man spun the weapon, alert, while Thalia held the sword firmly. When Nox turned around, he noticed that even though she was filled with fear, she didn't lose focus. He thought it was important to warn her. Swinging the dagger without reason could hurt her, so it was better not to interfere. He recommended that she conserve her strength and only use it if it was necessary to flee. If she were caught off guard, she would have a better chance of escaping. She glared at him with anger, but he remained firm. He believed that only this way her chances of survival would increase, even if only slightly. He observed the wolves and reflected that in the end, defeating an elite gray wolf wasn't as risky as it seemed. Looking back at Thalia, he evaluated that it would be excellent if she stayed vigilant and reacted intelligently to whatever happened. Although he acknowledged that she seemed well-trained, he still didn't feel comfortable trusting his back to her. Turning his gaze forward, he prepared for what was to come. The genius ability activated, surrounding him with flames. He was determined to use it and quickly finish off the wolf. The animal stared at him, and Nox opened his eyes, drawing the girl's attention, who looked at him in surprise. The animals growled, showing their teeth. Nox, with a slight smile, seemed to enjoy the fact that no one had ever said that he himself was the real threat. The wolf lunged, and he responded with a powerful strike, cutting through the air. The other wolves hesitated, stopping for a moment. The hero stared them down. One of them, with one eye injured, watched him intently. In the blink of an eye, the animals resumed charging. The wolf leaped at Nox, who attacked it. The animal circled around him aggressively. In a sudden move, it opened its mouth for a fierce attack. Nox quickly spun his body. The wolf flew toward him. He, startled, looked away. Thalia screamed, warning him to be careful. Although Nox had ordered her to flee if the situation worsened, Thalia remained sitting on a tree branch, firm in her decision. She couldn't accept the idea of leaving him alone. The protagonist watched her carefully and reflected that, seeing the situation, Thalia made the decision to help him. With a hesitant voice, she called out, asking if he was okay and if he had been hurt. Nox, thinking about her, could hardly believe that she had truly decided to help him. Meanwhile, a growl echoed nearby. Nox turned just in time to see the wolf running toward him, so he instinctively attacked, keeping the sword firmly in his hands. He stated that he was fine and, in his thoughts, acknowledged that this wasn't the moment to be distracted by such emotions. Thalia, relieved, silently thanked him. Nox, however, furrowed his brow, thinking that he was behaving pathetically. Looking down, he noticed his sword was still firm in his grip. He realized that the wolf's next move, the famous backward roll, was about to begin. He saw the animal's paw touch the ground and concluded that there was still time to react. The wolf's eyes glowed in the darkness. He then smiled, aware that he had managed to rise again. One wolf walked beside him, causing him to turn his head, facing it directly. They exchanged intense stares. The wolf bared its teeth in a threatening gesture. Then it lunged forward. Nox, startled, thought he was being attacked and quickly turned. However, the wolf merely passed by him. Surprised, the protagonist opened his mouth, perplexed. Immediately, he classified the animal's behavior as an aberration, finding it ironic that anyone could confuse who the true threat was. Turning again, he concluded that it was too late for any reconsideration. The animal ran straight toward him, and he shouted as blood sprayed through the air. Thalia called to him, alarmed. The wolf fled shortly afterward. Nox grabbed his shoulder, cursing in pain. He reflected intensely on his condition. aware that his level was still only 2.5 stars. Even so, he believed he was strong. The weapon remained in his hands as he accepted, with some frustration that the elite gray wolf was far smarter than in the games. He adopted a combat stance, judging that he had made a mistake. Turning his head, he concluded that this should have become clear the moment the wolf began controlling other monsters and using the terrain to its advantage. Suddenly, something moved in the bushes. A rising noise indicated that something else was approaching quickly. Nox thought with fear that he would need to defend himself first. He struck out, believing he had hit his target. However, the animal continued to circle around him. Suddenly, Nox's eyes widened. The wolf, enraged, bared its teeth and soon opened its mouth. Nox realized that the monster was waiting for the perfect moment, a tiny opening. He grabbed his weapon, aware that he needed to act. When he moved his shoulder, he screamed in pain. He bared his teeth as blood trickled from his mouth. His eyes wide, he realized he had been counterattacked. The wolf, mouth wide open, lunged again. Nox hadn't expected this move. Perhaps he had been too careless, confident from having played that game so many times. He felt like he could do anything, and that was his mistake. Looking up, he understood just how foolish that assumption had been. He closed his eyes and curled up, preparing for the worst. However, a sudden sound made him open his eyes again. A weapon flew toward the wolf. He recognized the object as a dagger. He thought that if he could hit the monster's weak spots, he might repeat the same strategy. Looking at the girl, he understood that it wouldn't be with his own hands, but with hers. The weapon gleamed in the air, accompanied by a shout. Nox ran forward, shouting as well. His sword pierced the animal's body. The wolf opened its mouth wide. The dagger flew out through the creature's snout. Nox's hand trembled as he knelt on the ground beside the lifeless wolf. Thalia, fearful, called out to him again. She watched the scene, mouth agape, in a state of shock. The other wolves stared at the two of them, confused. Moments later, they fled. Thalia jumped from the tree and ran to Nox. When she got close, she asked, visibly shaken, if he was okay. Nox replied that he was fine. He wiped the blood away and stated that he had survived. He staggered a little, then lifted his eyes toward her. Seeing the frightened girl, he thought that maybe one day he would thank the enemy who would kill him in the future. He told her not to worry. His arm was bleeding. Thalia exclaimed, amazed, asking how he could consider that normal. Nox bent down and casually responded that it was just a scratch. She confirmed, but was still worried. He repeated that everything was fine. She smiled, relieved, and said she was glad he hadn't been hurt anywhere else. However, when she looked at his shoulder, her expression changed. Her eyes widened, confused. Nox turned abruptly, realizing that there were still monsters nearby. Thalia then attacked the hero. Confused, he called her name. Thalia warned that there was a spider staring at the small arthropod with a horrified expression. The creature returned the gaze, which made her scream and cling to the young man beside her. He in turn remained calm, only wondering how much longer she would stay attached to him. Nox gave a slight smile and with a hint of irony asked if she was truly afraid of the spider. Then he sighed, reflecting that if such a small creature was enough to scare her, it was curious that she had decided to accompany him to the forest. Thalia, embarrassed, turned her face away and tried to justify herself, claiming that after all, it was just a spider and not something that terrifying. Nox blinked and jokingly remarked that at this rate, she would never become a knight. Upon hearing this, Thalia understood the teasing and became visibly indignant, while he seemed pleased that she had finally let go of him. Raising his hand covered by a glove, he covered his face, which caught Thalia's attention. She asked if he was all right. The young man understood that this moment was related to a deeper thought, so he explained that he had told her before not to worry so much. He looked at her and realized that perhaps she was regaining her composure. Nox smiled, recognizing that in a way he owed his survival to her, and although he hadn't had the time to say this before, due to the confusion with the spider, he finally thanked her. The girl, feeling awkward with the comment, repeated her question, concerned about his condition. Nox looked ahead and mentioned that a paw was getting closer to the fire, adding that they just needed to leave the forest. At that moment, sounds came from the bushes. Elsewhere, the maid was crying, believing that the death of her mistress was her fault. Someone stood still in front of her, reflecting on whether the situation had been resolved or not. The man with the monocle, in turn, was thinking about Lin's disappearance, wondering how this would create tension between the families, especially since other children had also disappeared in the same area. Furrowing his brow, he commented that rumors about the incompetence of that family were already circulating. Soon after, someone pointed ahead, asking Rodwell to look. The mist began to dissipate exactly where he pointed, which caught the man's attention. He observed with enthusiasm, announcing that the forest of lost children had been purified. A girl, surprised, asked if that was really what she thought. Rodwell confirmed, explaining that the end of the mana meant the forest was now safe. The people with torches listened carefully when he stated that the opportunity they had all been waiting for had come to fruition. Despite the euphoria, the maid continued to worry about Nox. Meanwhile, he and Thalia walked through an open field. Nox stared at the path ahead when a voice emerged announcing his departure. Many began shouting, incredulous at the scene before them. He had emerged from the forest as though nothing had happened. Rodwell smiled, overwhelmed with a sense of relief. Now he was sure The succession structure of that family was about to crumble. He wondered why so many people were gathered there. The maid, upon finding Thalia again, rushed to her and hugged her, saying that everyone had been worried. The man with the monocle clarified that there had been great concern when they heard about Nox's disappearance. With a discreet smile, Nox replied that it still seemed strange to him to think that someone truly cared, since he felt the reputation of his family crumbling more each day. The maid, emotional, cried with relief. Placing a hand on Thalia's shoulder, she remarked that it would be necessary to remind everyone of rule number 6, also known as the lineage rule, and asked them to follow it. Thalia apologized, somewhat embarrassed, but the girl in the apron said she wouldn't let her blame herself, revealing that the patriarch himself had offered to teach her. Nox observed everything attentively, noticing the impressive resilience of the girl, equivalent to 2 units. The maid turned to Nox, thanking him for protecting her mistress. Thalia, embarrassed, listened in silence while Nox explained that although he hadn't intended to bring anyone with him, she had done very well, and she shouldn't blame herself so much for it. Thalia seemed touched by his words. Above, the crown of the trees swayed gently, with the building visible in the background. Someone had left a sheath and a bag on a chair. Nox removed part of his clothing, satisfied that he had completed everything. Fixing his hair, he muttered to himself that he never imagined seeing Rodwell and the knights waiting for them near the forest. He concluded that life was full of surprises and wondered if, in the end, all of this revolved around Thalia. He smiled at the thought. Putting his hand in his pocket, he realized his plan would work. He took out a ring, noticing it was a Christmas egg. The system notified him that he had received a new artifact, the Ring of Black Flame. While the ring glowed, the system explained that its category was accessory, of low mid-level with the darkness attribute. The item increased the user's resistance and mana by 1 unit and could only be used by those capable of manipulating dark mana. The narrator explained that by defeating an enemy with the ring, the user could absorb part of the opponent's life force, integrating it into their own. The stronger the enemy, the more energy would be absorbed. Nox looked at the ring and recognized that there was no other object capable of performing such a feat. Clenching it in his hand, he reflected that while this didn't guarantee a long life, perhaps it would be enough. He knew that life couldn't be extended indefinitely, and that, considering the small amount of power extracted, it would hardly overcome a fatal disease. Still, he put the ring on his finger, thinking that anything was better than an empty existence on the brink of death. He closed his eyes and felt his life force and mana grow. He called for Lona, certain she was nearby, and asked her to come in. When she opened the door, the girl wanted to know if he could see through things. He replied that anything was possible, and Lona, surprised, covered her face with her hands, asking if he could see her without clothes. Nox, not understanding, gave her a light slap. She rubbed the spot where she had been hit, intrigued by the strength of the strike, which seemed greater than usual. He suggested she stop saying nonsense and challenged her to an arm wrestling match. Lona sighed and said that if she won again, he should raise her salary. Nox agreed, but warned that if she lost, she would suffer a 20% salary cut. They started the countdown. He smiled, counted to 2, and immediately defeated her. Surprised, Lona got up and remarked that it would be embarrassing for the son of such a respected family to reduce the salary of a simple employee. Nox acknowledged that she was right. Despite this, Lona seemed downcast, saying that there were many rumors about him and that other malicious tongues always made up stories. Nox, smiling, declared that's why he decided not to care about honor anymore. She sincerely apologized, but he was confused by her change in attitude. Then the system notified him that the effect of his incurable disease trait had been activated. He was now suffering from a level 2 fracture in his wrists and a level 1 cold. Irritated by the negative traits, he turned to Lona and informed her that the salary cut had been cancelled. In exchange, he asked for ice and a wet towel. She realized that he didn't look well at all. Hey everyone, did you enjoy this story? I really liked it. If you want to follow the next part, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. See you in the next story, guys.